This week, we're bringing you part 2 of the Australian bush murders. We're recording this episode way ahead of time, so we don't have any sassy announcements. Live long and prosper, man.
Yeah, hell yeah. That sounds right to me. Big announcement. I think part 1 video went well, so we're rolling forward with video for part 2. Still no promises. There's a crazy, I don't want to explain the technical things, but
nobody cares.
I think that I have every reason to believe you can watch the video for part 1 and hopefully part 2. So anyways, those are available on Spotify and YouTube if you want to see our LA10 faces and Muriel's Pilates arms at the end of part 1. Okay.
All right. Great.
Yeah.
Most of this series is built off of the book In the Dead of Night by Greg Hadrick. It's really good. Check it out. All right. This is a true story involving murder, violence, drugs, adult themes, etc. So if any listeners are like Nick and don't want to hear about those kind of things, go listen to a different podcast.
We joke, we curse, we're ignorant, but you should know that already because you already listened to part 1. And if for some reason you're just here, instead of go back and listen to part 1 first, and then get a vibe of who we are.
All right, Nikki. Are you ready to hear this story?
No.
Okay. Let's get started. So.
Yes. Everyone's missing.
Pandemic times.
Yes.
Early pandemic times. We're making runs on toilet paper, learning how to bake bread, doom scrolling. Everything is nuts and scary.
Yeah, you're not even supposed to wear masks at this point.
Yeah,
remember when they were like, if you wear a mask, you're stealing from nurses or whatever?
And then we were like sewing our own masks. There's a lot of stuff going on. So investigators in this case were faced with this insane, they're faced with this insane case of missing septuagenarian clandestine lovers. And they had this absolutely haunting, burnt out crime scene, no forensic evidence, witnesses on lockdown, and their manpower basically scattered to the wind. By April 22nd, investigators had given up on finding the couple alive, but the investigation into their disappearance was ongoing. With the thin evidence they were working with, they decided to make a public plea for witnesses Investigators figured they'd throw out a bunch of information to the public to see if anyone saw Carol and Russell kicking it near Buck's camp the weekend they disappeared. And the only thing they had going for them was lots of people had the same idea as Russell and Carol the weekend of March 20th. Victoria was under a state of emergency at the time. Lockdowns were looming. And, it might have been the last weekend for some fun times before the dark times. So there were actually tons of hunters, campers, and bikers around that weekend. So through witness sightings, investigators were able to piece together a timeline of Carol and Russell's movements before they disappeared. Mm. On March 19th, 2020, Russell packed up the car, said goodbye to his wife, Robin, and headed out to pick up his mistress for a final last hurrah, the world is burning camping trip. Both Carol and Russell's cell phones pinged cell phone towers on the way into the Wanangata Valley near a lunch spot on May 19th, probably using the lunch money Russell's wife gave him on his way out the door that day. At some point, Robin tried to call a friend about problems she was having with an email, At some point, Carol tried to call a friend in the car about problems she was having with an email, but it was sort of a comedy of errors. Carol couldn't figure out how to deal with some files on her mobile phone. She couldn't read the small text on her phone. And then finally she was like, I'm going into the bush. I'm not going to have reception. Okay. Yeah. So they just gave up and said goodbye.
Okay. Yeah.
And then after that, their cell phones went dark. There was no cell reception in the area of the valley where they were camping. From there, the couple drove down the Zika Spur track. So later, police found The two guys driving behind them actually remember the whole thing. They got annoyed with Russell's slow driving and tried to pass, but they said Russell sped up and they had a sort of friendly drag race until Russell pulled off into a camping spot. And at the turnoff to Buck's camp, there were a couple of weed sprayers spraying for blackberries. Robert Williams said usually people slowed down to wave or chat, but he remembered on the 19th, a white Toyota Land Cruiser with an older couple in the front seat just tearing past them. Robert told investigators, quote, "He drove past quickly without stopping or even waving to me, which I thought was a bit odd. I thought, grumpy old bugger must be on a mission to get somewhere." Then later,
I don't know why it's so funny.
on the 19th around 5 p.m., Robert, the weed sprayer, said someone flew a drone around his workspace videotaping him. And he thought, all right, he waves to the drone, but it's pretty rude. It's kind of invasive. It's loud. It makes a buzzing sound.
I've been pissed every time I've been subjected to a drone.
It's annoying, especially when you're like really wanting to be out in the wilderness and you don't want to hear. Just even the noise would bother me. But anyway, whatever. So he was annoyed, right? And then he was like watching the drone hover over a couple other campsites that evening as well. So it's like this guy is just really has no sense of decorum with that thing. Robert Williams also had a little, like a tad bit more information. So he'd been spraying blackberries all of that same week. And earlier on the 18th of March, he said this super sweaty guy wearing shorts, a singlet, and rubber boots up to the knees to protect from snakes, he stopped by.
Singlet?
Yeah.
Like a bodybuilder, like a weight, like someone.
Like kind of like a erotic looking tank top. That's what I'm guessing.
Okay, because he's wearing that and shorts.
And shorts. And then he's wearing these things. I call them boots, but really they're gaiters. So like you have shoes and then you put these big like rubber coverings on. Mm-hmm. And that's something they recommend for hiking sometimes, but also it helps with snake attacks. And you're in Australia, so you gotta be careful. So anyway, singlet, shorts, thigh-high gaiters. And he looked kind of rocked. Like he was red and hot. And, it was early COVID. So, nobody really knew what COVID looked like. And everyone was on edge. So this sweaty dude really stuck out to this maintenance worker. Anyway, the sweaty dude, he asked where to camp, if there was a good campsite not nearby. And they told him to try the camp at Bucks Creek. A couple other hunters corroborated this story, although no one could remember what the sweaty man's vehicle looked like. The next day, the 19th, Robert Williams then saw Russell and Carol speeding off to Buck's camp. Robert said that he saw the Land Cruiser parked down by Buck's camp, presumably near the sweaty guy in the rubber boots from the, he said he saw them parked down there from the 19th to the 20th, but he didn't hear any fighting or anything like that. So there was potentially a sweaty man hanging out near where Carol and Russell were last seen, but they didn't have a license plate or anything. And the BlackBerry guy wasn't sure what the vehicle looked like, thought it could have been white, but, that's it. It's pretty much a dead end. On March 20th, so this is still back on this timeline of Carol and Russell. So on March 20th, the day after they set up camp at Buck's Camp, another park worker reported seeing the drone. So people can say, yes, Russell was out there flying his drone. And then at 6 p.m., Russell joined his nightly ham radio call, happy as a clam, and signed off at 6:40. After that, all investigators had was a couple of cell phone tower pings from Russell's phone the next morning, about 40 miles from the Bucks campsite in a mountain range near Hotham Heights before the phone went off for good.
Are they able to tell what those pings are? Like, oh, that was a call. That was just the internet surge.
The pings are just the phone connecting to the cell tower. So it just means it's on.
Yeah.
And in range of a tower.
Right.
So
Okay.
the pings aren't related to action of the phone. They're just kind of related to the location of the phone.
Okay.
An hour or so after the last ping, a fellow camper, Andrew Marquardt, was the first to document Russell and Carol's incinerated campsite. So that's the morning of Saturday, March 21st. After that, there were no more sightings of the couple or the drone, no proof of life clues. Carol and Russell hadn't touched their bank accounts, hadn't used their phone, hadn't had any contact with relatives. But investigators had a small list of suspects: mountain weirdos and those guys who drove aggressively with Russell on their way into the valley were on the suspect list. And they did have this small window of time between the last time Russell spoke to his ham radio buddies at 6 p.m. on Friday, March 20th, and then the first person to see and photograph the burnt out campsite at Bucks Camp the next morning at 11 a.m. Presumably, this is when the couple went missing.
Right.
And they had the cell phone data, which led to their first and probably most significant break in the case. Investigators this whole time were on the hunt for any CCTV footage taken around the time of Russell's last cell phone pings. But it was such a remote area, there just wasn't much. There weren't cameras up. But there were a few cameras thrown up in this one little section of Great Alpine Road that were to try and catch people driving through the Mountain Hotham Resort without paying the resort fee. Russell's phone pinged a cell tower at Hotham Heights right by the cameras on the morning of Saturday, March 21st. And then 10 seconds later at 9:48 a.m., a dark-colored Nissan Patrol pulling a trailer passed by the cameras, with a single man who was not Russell Hill sitting behind the wheel. So investigators got 4 clear pictures, including a license plate. The car wasn't registered to anyone on their suspect list, just a random guy named Gregory Stewart Lynn. He was an upper middle class suburban dad, a pilot for the budget airline Jetstar. He was married to a flight attendant and raising a blended family, kids from his first marriage and then one son that they had together. All investigators knew was that he had been camping in the Onondaga Valley starting on March 16th, or he had left to go camping around March 16th. And they did know, more than likely, for some reason, at some point, he had Russell's phone. Given his background, investigators determined he was probably the least likely of their people of interest, but they decided to have a chat with him just to clear up his whereabouts and see whether he had been in contact with Carol or Russell. So on July 14th, 2020, a team from the Missing Persons Department headed out to the suburbs of Melbourne to have just a chat with Greg Lynn, hoping to see if he'd witnessed anything or seen the couple. And Greg was an open book. He was calm. He was very precise. And, he's a pilot, so that makes sense, right? He's been in the area hunting alone that weekend like he normally did, crisscrossing around to different campsites, moving around really often. And he hadn't seen Russell or Carol and didn't mention camping at all at Bucks Camp. He said he had never stopped there. Greg had a reasonable, detailed account of his trip, but since he traveled alone and he hadn't spoken with anyone, he had no witnesses to corroborate or deny this detailed story. Yeah. But he seemed totally open and happy to talk. When officers noticed that Greg had painted his dark-colored Nissan Patrol a light beige color, Greg sort of laughed it off. He said, yeah, I know, okay. It was a COVID project for his stir-crazy kids. And then after about an hour of talking, investigators left, but they left with mild tingles. A phone ping matching a video of Greg's car was weird, but maybe explainable. There were ways to kind of it's still circumstantial. The new paint job was a bit of a coincidence, but actually they had documentation through vehicle registration papers that it wasn't the first time Greg had changed the color of his car. He was in the habit of doing that.
That doesn't that doesn't mean anything. If anything, that means something else.
And actually, kind of weirdly, the most nagging thing at the time to investigators was that while Greg seemed really open and very happy to talk with investigators, he had ignored pleas from the police to come forward for months. Like, they had been saying, like, if you were in the area at this time, please come forward. Any information is helpful. If you saw anything, just let us know you were up there, right? They've been asking for this for months. So, like, why didn't he just check in to say he'd been up in the mountains? He was fully aware of the investigation and fully aware of police asking the public for help. So if he was so eager to help now, why hadn't he come forward before? They just thought that his attitude just seemed like a little strange.
Sure. Okay, I get that.
But I mean, it's not a lot to go off of. Anyway, they kept Greg at the bottom of their persons of interest lists and instead started interviewing their top 4 suspects, starting with Tom Collins. Their number 1 suspect in the disappearance of Carol and Russell was a gnarly local bushman called Tom Collins. Now, he'd been a suspect in another murder case, but was never charged due to lack of evidence. He was violent. He had a police record that included assault and robbery. Tom was known to shoot off his guns if he got too close to his property. And he definitely was out there occasionally robbing campsites in the valley. And investigators figured this could have been a case of a robbery gone wrong. Like, Tom saw this tricked out Land Cruiser and figured, there's going to be all kinds of expensive goodies inside, which there were, like lots of electronics and stuff. They figure maybe Russell and Carol caught Tom in the act of robbing them, and then Tom killed them and burned the evidence or something like that. So investigators went to his property on pins and needles with drones overhead and waited for him to come off the property to his car before interviewing him, because they figured if they set foot on his land, then things would probably end in a shootout.
Okay.
So everybody's like, on pins and needles, all freaked out about this guy. So police interviewed him, and instead of what they were expecting, instead of him being cagey or defensive or aggressive, Tom Collins was practically giddy. Because the weekend of March 20th, he'd been out of town helping his mom stock up for the COVID lockdowns. And Tom Collins told police, quote, "Go do all that shit you can do with this stuff, yeah? Phone, credit card, toll tag. You won't find nothing on me, you fuckheads. You need the button man. He's your fucking murderer."
Okay, so they're beefing. They don't like each other.
Well, the cops, they checked out Tom Collins' alibi, and he was right, man.
Yeah.
Totally checked out. He was out there helping his mom.
Awesome. So
next, investigators went for their number 2 suspect, the button man. And they eventually tracked him down in the bush at his mountainside lair, where he was legit sitting there making buttons. And they spoke for hours.
What's he doing with all these buttons? He sells them?
Who knows? It's just his thing.
He has jars of buttons.
Yeah, maybe they break.
Yeah, maybe they're just the worst buttons ever crafted. So
they're just cool.
Lots of them.
Yeah. They just look cool, man. So they actually talked to him for hours, a lot about how the button man loved the bush and how he hated campers for spoiling it. And certain things came to light. The button man, you see, he owned a house in Melbourne. He wasn't strictly the button man all year round. And on the weekend of March 20th, he'd been in Melbourne stocking up on supplies with a plan to come back to the bush land once the lockdown started. He said, "Check my phone records." And when investigators looked shocked at the idea that the button man had a phone, he said, quote, "I'm not a bloody Neanderthal." I can't make calls up here, but I keep it charged through the car so I can play chess and Tetris and stuff.
They're like, so you're basically just one of the campers you claim to hate? It's like, yeah. What do you mean?
But I live here. He's like, I just have to make sure I have enough fuel to play Tetris. And the button man, his alibi checked out as well.
Uh-huh.
He's totally where he was when he said he was. He was in Melbourne that whole time. Then finally, police turned to the third and fourth suspects, the guys who drag raced Russell down the Zika spur track on March 19th.
Mm-hmm.
Little aggro. So they were two fun-loving Eastern European guys, Goran Milojevic and Damir Jovar, who were hanging out in New South Wales. And when they heard about that, was like they kind of like had left and gone to New South Wales.
Uh-huh.
So when they heard about the investigation, they came forward really willingly. They were like, "Oh yeah, we totally remember that shiny new white Land Cruiser and the grumpy man behind the wheel for sure." They had been stuck behind Russell all through the Zika spur track and then along the Wangata track. And he was driving really slow, so they thought they'd pull off the dirt road and into the open grassland to pass him. But as soon as they did, Russell sped up. And he was like, well, so they raced the Land Cruiser. Uh-huh. They were just like, I guess that's what we're doing, man. Out here with the weirdos, right? And they raced the Land Cruiser until Russell veered it off towards Buck's camp. And then after that adventure, the dudes set up camp kind of nearby, but not at Buck's camp. They picked some mushrooms, and then they went over to the blackberry weed sprayer guys to ask if the mushrooms were edible. And then they ate them. Then they camped overnight, and they said, during the day, they saw Russell and Carol walking together wearing big sun hats and smiling. They all waved hello to each other. And then, that night the men camped. They didn't hear anything suspicious.
Yeah.
And then they headed back to Sydney in the morning. Their alibis totally checked out as well. And after all that, pilot Greg Lynn was the only suspect they couldn't completely eliminate.
Yeah.
So they decided to look into Greg's background. He started out as a handsome pilot in his 20s, blue eyes, curly reddish brown hair. After 2 marriages, 3 kids, an illegitimate love child, and a stint flying in Dubai, he found himself working as a high-level pilot flying for Jetstar Airlines out of Melbourne, making about $400,000 a year. He was a checker. So in addition to flying himself, he actually graded other pilots' performances. And then 2020 hit, and flights were grounded because of the pandemic. So Greg lost his fat paycheck and his prestigious job. Mm-hmm. And by the summer of 2020, Greg Lynn looks sort of like one of those stress dolls you squeeze and the face pops out. It's like pink, greasy salt and pepper hair, heavy lidded wine time eyes, He was 53 and living with his 3 sons and second wife in the suburbs of Melbourne. And he was into deer hunting and pig hunting using guns, daggers, and knives. So Greg didn't have a criminal record, but it turns out his first wife died a terrible and somewhat suspicious death. When Greg was 21, he married his first wife, Lisa, who had just turned 18. And the couple moved a lot for work and finally settled down in the early 90s in Melbourne in the western suburbs. And Lisa worked as a flight attendant while Greg was a pilot. They had 2 sons back to back starting in 1997. And then in 1999, Lisa was found dead of a drug overdose curled in a ball in their front yard. At the time, Lisa and Greg were estranged. So the boys were asleep in their bed. They had no idea what had happened. They were only just like 1 and kind of like 2.5 years old. Lisa had apparently mixed pills with alcohol, went through some old family photo albums, left them scattered across the living room, and then crawled outside and died in the grass. Her mother had actually been en route from Tasmania to help Lisa through her upcoming divorce when Lisa died. And Lisa's mother later said, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, Greg is responsible for my daughter's death, by mental torture inflicted by him. Now, Lisa's mom said she personally witnessed Greg's quote unquote bizarre abusive behavior towards her daughter. He was physically and mentally abusive, like screaming, throwing things, pushing Lisa around. Her mom said, quote, he has done things in the past like killing animals, a neighbor's pet, refusing to feed the children when he was supposed to be looking after them. And then shortly before their separation, Lisa told her parents Greg was making death threats against her. So Lisa's death was deemed not suspicious. It was a classic overdose, although it isn't clear whether or not her death was intentional.
Sure.
And Lisa's mom says she fully accepts that Greg wasn't physically there when Lisa died. That's been proven, but that she believes that he drove her to overdose with his abusive behavior. So after Lisa died, there was a long drawn out court battle over who would get custody over the two little boys. Greg won the court case and separated the kids from their maternal grandparents. After Greg got custody of the boys, he moved them in with his mistress. She gave birth to a baby girl just about a year after Lisa died. And then Greg and the mistress broke up. He left his daughter behind and he moved his sons to Qatar. And he worked as a pilot there. He married another flight attendant in 2004. And then he moved everyone back to Australia and had a son with his new wife, Melanie. So by early 2021, Greg Lynn was the primary suspect in the disappearance of Carol and Russell. And investigators felt that they were dealing with a double homicide. Early 2021 also brought the second major lockdown in Victoria. Alpine National Park was closed, so investigators couldn't get in to visit the crime scene in the Wollongata Valley. And when they finally combed through it, they found nothing from any third party. It was all the evidence was pretty much obliterated. They didn't find anything except for things belonging to Russell and Carol. The only option they had at this point was to try and elicit a confession from Greg Lynn. And they figured the best bet was just to put him under surveillance and see if he slips and says something. The last resort was this surveillance thing in hopes of collecting a confession. But the problem was the family was housebound on lockdown. So normally they would sneak in while the family was out of the house and install all of this equipment, but that wasn't an option. COVID times called for desperate measures. So they ended up doing what's called a hot install, when you basically bug a house while everyone is inside. So in the dead of night, a team of 3 skinny, super quiet dudes dressed in black, they slipped into the house like around 3:37 a.m. while one of Greg's sons was awake, sitting upstairs playing on his Xbox. They bugged every room in the house, including the master bedroom, with video and audio.
Damn.
And the whole thing took less than 23 minutes, which is pretty crazy.
Well, that also seems like a really long time to be like sneaking around someone's house especially when someone's awake. Like, what skilled ninjas?
Yeah, that's like some pretty crazy stuff. And then like,
that's the kind of thing that makes me respect them, and also just like fear that, it's like, damn, they can do that. That's crazy.
And all the investigators were like sitting in this comms room, like watching all the video coming up live on all the screens. Like, oh, now they've got the master bedroom. Now they've got the kitchen, like watching everything come online.
So they must have gotten like a search warrant or whatever thing from some Australian judge.
So yes. So this was already a little bit too long.
Yeah.
But in the background of all of this, they had this like really like a lot of very thin evidence.
Yeah.
And it was enough to get these search warrants, but like it was very reluctant, and they all had these like expiration dates. They're like, okay,
Yeah.
We'll let you do it, but you only get 3 months. And if you don't get any other evidence, we're cutting you off. And so this whole time that they're working, they're also working against the time limits of these warrants.
Yeah.
And so the warrants like would expire, and then they would collect more information and apply for more warrants. And they'd have to like ramp up the investigation when they only had a couple of weeks left in the warrant.
Right.
So it's like this constant push and pull with the warrants, which were actually really hard to get.
Sure.
All right. So they're all bugged up, and I have to find my place in the script. Hold on. Okay. So they get the whole thing bugged up, and nothing happened because the Lynn family was just miserable, stuck at home. They barely spoke to each other. Greg,
it's just like you and me listening to our separate podcasts or whatever.
Greg took up beekeeping. Like the only thing they did discover, which helped them extend the warrants, was that Greg had been returning to the Onondaga Valley each time the lockdowns lifted. So he'd been back twice so far. But life marched on. Things started opening up again. And soon, Jetstar Airlines was gearing up to reopen. So now their suspected murderer will be flying hundreds of people around in hunks of metal. So they could warn Jetstar about the investigation, but then the airline would probably ground Greg again, expose the investigation, and Greg would just clam up like a clam. There's no way they're going to get him to talk again.
Clam up like a clam.
Or they could not warn Jetstar, preserve the investigation, and then Greg could end up killing a bunch of people in a fiery plane crash.
That doesn't seem very realistic, though.
Well, a forensic psychologist working for investigators went through all the surveillance tapes and Greg's background, and they made a prediction. So a lot of this, well, some of it was based on Greg's habit of writing checklists. And this forensic psychologist said, well, Greg doesn't just write checklists for himself. He also writes them for the rest of his family. He is in charge of everyone around him. They can only do what he allows them to do or tells them to do. And that's after she's combed through all this evidence, right? Mm-hmm. He expects to be in charge of any situation he finds himself in. If he is forced into a situation where he is not in charge, it will drive him crazy. Other narcissists with a similar outlook have been known to go out with a grand gesture of defiance. For example, rather than let themselves be put in a position where others will be in charge of them. A final act expressing their ability to control the fate of others, which is a way of flipping the finger to those like you who are trying to control their fate. So that's her hot take.
So that sounds like a plane crash.
So basically, at this point, this psychologist's conclusion was that if Greg figured out he was being investigated for the double murder, his personality type might lead him to crash a commercial jet on purpose and kill everyone on board just to show that he was still in control, even if he was technically dead.
Okay, so that means don't tell the...
They pretty much had to warn Jetstar so they would ground him. They were like, we can't risk that we don't tell anyone and he figures it out.
Okay.
And then he goes and kills a bunch of people. So the investigation is like totally up in flames. Their warrants running out. And then Greg got attacked by bees.
Oh, the beekeeper feels this thing.
Greg's new pandemic hobby was beekeeping.
Yeah.
And days before he was supposed to start up at Jetstar again, some bees got into his bee suit and went to town stinging his ass off. And this man went into anaphylactic shock.
Oh, damn.
So he was rushed to the emergency room. And due to official protocol, his pilot's medical certificate was suspended. And he was grounded for 6 months until his next physical.
Which meant that they didn't have to tell the airline.
And the investigation was back, baby.
Which badass cop did that on purpose? Cut a little hole, put a little pheromone, whatever it takes to get bees to go into it.
So now they settled in to really watch Greg and get him, let's catch him talking. And they found Greg had literally zero friends. He didn't talk to anybody. He barely spoke to his wife. And when he did, it was just kind of superficial nothingness. He only talked to himself while he was driving his car.
Oh, God. Oh.
So investigators listened in and found out some pretty wild stuff. He was a huge bigot. Said all kinds of horrible things about just about every type of person. He jacked off in the car using sunscreen and dirty talking himself. He screamed at the DJ on the radio. He screamed to himself about bad service he had gotten at a restaurant. He screamed at a dog who barked at him as he drove by. He screamed about his broken washing machine at his house. He was full of road rage and blasted his music as loud as it would go and just kind of like scream, sang along. One time, he was at a red light and this posh-looking guy in a suit told him to turn his music down. And Greg straight up ran the guy off the road, chased him down, and punched him in the face. And, he did some suspicious muttering, like, let's see if the cops turn up. If they do, we know they can put a tracker on it. Who decides what's right and wrong? That's the thing. Judgment. Judge does. The law does. The community does. Or one time he muttered, little old people, they looked at me like that. Fair enough. Fair enough. So over the ensuing months, police made more than 5,000 covert recordings of Greg Lynn. It was a gold mine. And ultimately, the jury heard none of it because even though it was pretty entertaining and at times incriminating, it was deemed irrelevant to the case. Nothing was specifically like, I killed Carol and Greg, right?
Yeah, right. So it was a gold mine for you and all the people who want to spy on people, all the nosy MFers out there.
Well, it kind of did paint a picture of his explosive rage and sort of unhinged personality.
And then did that stuff you said, like that his first wife's mother said, they know about all of that by now. That the investigators
they know that at least her family alleges that he was incredibly abusive.
Right, and killed animals and all that stuff.
Yeah. So investigators, they're not getting anything substantial. They're getting like masturbation sessions and screaming at DJs and stuff like that.
With sunscreen, which hey man, whatever floats your boat, but I just, but whatever floats your banana boat,
good one. I feel like he probably isn't the kind of guy who had like better skincare in his car. I'm surprised he had sunscreen. So they're not getting anything substantial with the surveillance. So they decided to turn up the heat with media outlets. They figured out which TV stations and shows that Greg watched, which radio programs he listens to. And then they made this concerted effort to partner up with the producers from these different radio and TV stations and get them to run little mini pieces on the investigation, run antagonizing stories about like what they were finding next into the disappearance of Carol and Russell, teasing things about how they'd find new evidence or they were close to solving the case, hoping they could poke Greg into some sort of blind rage confession in his car. And it almost worked. They were running a piece on one of Greg's habitual radio stations, kind of speculating on what happened to Greg and Carol. The DJ said something like, quote, were they dead or had they eloped? What did people think? Trying to kind of get people to call into the station. And Greg to himself said, oh, they're sitting on a beach in fucking Queensland. Nudist beach. Butt naked. Playing with his fucking drone. Running up and down the beach. Taking pictures of young people. Who's got the biggest dick? All right. So now we're talking. He's like, now, okay. He's got something.
He knows who that is and that he has a drone.
Right. So investigators on the surveillance team, they just like went into action to try it right then and there to get a detective on the program to call in to the radio station for an impromptu interview. And while they're trying to arrange this within minutes, right, the DJ, the DJ tries to like kill some time, and he played a Beyonce song, which torpedoed the whole thing. The Beyonce song started, and Greg screamed, quote, "Beyonce, oh, for fuck's sake, don't give me fucking Beyonce." And then punched the radio until it turned off. So, not an excellent result, right?
That's hilarious.
It's not an excellent result. But the tactic, it showed some promise, right? So they decided to try again. Greg and his wife, Melanie, they loved watching 60 Minutes on Sundays. So investigators decided to pull off something extraordinary. An entire segment engineered to poke the bear, to send Greg Lynn off the deep end and either make a mistake or explode into a confession. And detectives did an interview on the program saying, oh, we're very close to solving the mystery. And they say the key to everything was this vehicle pulling a trailer. And then they just straight up showed all the pictures of Greg's car driving down Great Alpine Road 10 seconds after Russell Hill's last cell phone ping. So they didn't mention the cell phone ping, but it was the first time they had actually released the photographs of the Nissan Patrol ever in public.
Yeah.
And one of the detectives, he goes, my belief is this was not a planned or premeditated attack. It was something that happened quickly, which would probably mean whoever did it would have acted quickly in trying to conceal it. And the person who carried this out is probably just an ordinary member of the community who's operating in a normal job, but carrying this significant load on their mind. And there's this beat in the Lynn household while they're watching 60 Minutes. And then his wife, Melanie, just straight up said, "That's your car, isn't it?"
Yeah.
It looks like it. And Greg gets all uptight. He's like, "Yeah, but they've already talked to me. And I've already told them I was there that weekend. I never even saw those two. And I left at lunchtime. I wasn't even in the valley that night." And then Melanie, she kind of brushed it off. She laughed and she said, "Well, someone donked her on her head." But Greg was visibly freaking out. And later, he went out and took a retractable awning off his car to make it look less like the one on 60 Minutes. But like the police had already photographed his car. Like he was just spiraling out, acting more suspicious, ripping features off his car like a totally innocent dude. On November 21st, 2021, Jetstar Airlines called. Greg's probationary period was over, and they were happy to welcome him back. Greg told his wife he was going to take a solo camping trip to decompress before his big return to Jetstar. He was going to the Grampian mountain range. Now this time he's going west of Melbourne in the opposite direction of the Onondaga Valley. Investigators were probably going to have to warn Jetstar about the murder investigation, so this was it. The final Truman Show style freak out to try and goad Greg Lynn into confessing. And plan A, what they were going with, was to totally blow up his life while he was in the bush out of cell phone range. So what they were going to do is once he got into the bush, into the mountain range, they were going to call his parents, his in-laws, his boss, the people at his gun club, his extended family. And they were going to really politely just question them all about Greg and their communications with Greg and, everything they could talk to them about over Greg's behavior in the last year and a half. So then their plan was when Greg left the bush, he was going to start getting all these frantic notifications and dings from everyone that he knew. Greg would give up admit he had no other option and go to police to confess. But they never got that far because they freaked Greg out too bad and he started acting erratically. So investigators had to jump to a yet pretty much completely unformed plan B, and that's where we'll start up next week.
How did they freak him out? You mean he was just freaked in general?
With the 60 Minutes
Yeah, the
thing.
60-minute thing freaked him out too much.
Yeah,
Okay, I
that,
got it.
It was like they were like, they're engineering like a Truman Show thing. And they just showed this video for the first time. And they thought, oh, yeah, we're really going to push this tough guy. And, he just fucking, that was too much.
Well, damn, the forensic scientist better not be right. He's going to go freak out and do a mass shooting or something.
Return to us next week to find out the conclusion of this story.
Thank you so much for listening to Muriel's Murder. She did all the research. I did all the recording and editing. And either the succeeding or failing of the video stuff. You guys are the best. If you want part 3, it is available immediately via Patreon and or Spotify exclusive feeds. Otherwise, yeah, man, be good to yourself and each other. R.I.P. Jerry Springer.
Hold on to your butts.
All those good things. We love you. Goodbye.